Hi guys, thanks for tuning into another episode of Nuggets News. Well, I've got a wild episode for you guys today. Some of this stuff I've uncovered blew my mind, and we're going to be talking about how Australia has really been founded and infiltrated by these secret societies from day one, through some more ancient secrets and the history we're not told about Australia, as well as its role in the New World Order, Agenda 2030, how we seem to be a testbed for passing the most draconian laws and that type of thing. So stick with it. I think you guys are going to really enjoy this one today. But this is a monument in Manly in Sydney. People reporting that there's manholes around this. It might even be a bunker underneath or whatnot. But if we zoom in on this plaque, this is fascinating, right? New World Infrastructure Commission, Australis Project West, initiated 1829. And if we have a look at the bottom of the plaque, just as these hills watch over this region, we shall watch over the world. Together, we will shelter this land for 2094. So make of that what you will. But as you can see here on the plaque, it's got that Freemason, all-seeing eye symbolism and all this type of stuff, which I'm going to get into, is all through Canberra. I'm going to talk about a lot about Canberra as well in this episode. So obviously the official version of Australian history is Captain Cook and the British, 1778, that type of thing. But Australia's marked on all these old maps, 1519, some people say even earlier. And there's plenty of stories and evidence that we're going to touch on today that there were people that were colonized here, the Dutch, and maybe even older than that through to the Phoenicians thousands of years ago that were living here, with Aboriginal people. And obviously that is not what we're taught at school at all. But even Australia's geography is really unique. Most people live along the coast. There's so many mysteries that we hear about, stories and anomalies from the outback, and even hidden regions and anomalies around Kakadu that we're not allowed to access, that are just completely off limits to the public. And not only that, there's a lot of talk now about floods and cataclysms, and this sea level here is pretty low. So, was all of this connected back in the day? Which is super fascinating to think about as well. But let's move on to some of the more modern times and Operation Matchbox, which is related to Operation Paperclip, where all these Nazi scientists were brought to Australia and infiltrated our hospitals, psych departments, politics, all this type of thing, which we just, again, this is not mainstream knowledge at all, but you can look this up. Now, a lot of these experiments that were going on were, there were precursor programs even before this happened after World War II. William Mackenzie was one of the most famous, scientists in Australian history, but he was obsessed with children, disease, genetics, and not only that, the local fauna, particularly Aboriginal people and blood types and that type of thing. So this was another fascinating rabbit hole. Some of you will have been down, the rhesus factor, the blood types A, B, and O. And if the oldest continuous culture is Aboriginal people, the genetics and bloodlines and all this type of thing that the elites and scientists are just obsessed with, even to this day. This is fascinating to have a read about, which I'll get to some good articles on this topic in just a second. But when a lot of people came over here, they couldn't even believe some of the animals that are here. And Australia's got very unique animal species, right? It's almost like these marsupials are like a hybrid of a mammal and a reptile, that the mammals that can lay eggs. And this is very unique to Australia. And people just didn't even believe that these creatures are real because they look like hybrids or whatever back in the day. And not only that, we've got a lot of megafauna that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So again, how old is Australia? Why is it here and nowhere else? All these types of questions. So Archaics did a really interesting video on all this, and he's done plenty of videos covering Australia, and I'll link to these videos I mentioned down below. But this is a fantastic 6-part article series by the Australian Peacekeepers talking all about this MK Ultra and all these experiments that they're doing in Australia. And Fiona Barnett mentioned this in her testimony about Dr. Anthony Kidman, who's Nicole Kidman's father, working for the CIA, mind control research, a lot of the abuse that went on, that type of thing. And some of these quotes are just, unbelievable about what they were doing to native Aboriginal people here and that type of thing. Not only that, they were really obsessed with chemical and biological weapons. So some of you might have read about, like Lyme disease being created at Plum Island and all those experiments that were happening in the US, but this was all happening in Australia as well. And a lot of medical research continues to happen to this day in Australia, which is pretty controversial as well, which we might get to in future episode. But this 6-part series is brilliant. I'll link to it down below. They touch on the connections, Huxley and ASIO, even some of the connections to the CIA, the Dalai Lama, and all this type of thing that happened in Australia. So again, we seem to be a bit of a testbed for some of this stuff. But as I mentioned in that first part, Fiona Barnett, that documentary where she talks about the abuse that she underwent at the hands of those different people, I've touched on that before. A lot of this is kind of a result of these earlier programs of these scientists and people, these crazy doctors that came in and just did these experiments that you wouldn't get away with these days. Maybe they're still happening in underground labs or whatnot, but this type of stuff was kind of starting to get a bit mainstream throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, and then it obviously all got covered up, and I've touched on how this all connects to secret societies, politicians, people of influence in plenty of these videos that you guys can check out as well on the channel. One thing you might not have heard about before, though, is this connection here to foreign intelligence agencies and just how long they've kind of been running these blackmail influence rings over Australia. And look, a lot of this really came to a head when Gough Whitlam got overthrown. And he wasn't happy with the influence that the CIA and other foreign intelligence agencies were having over Australia. He wanted transparency around Pine Gap, the military base, which we're going to get to in just a second. But around that time as well, this was kind of when the UN, these NGOs that continue to basically control the world to this day, and our politicians are kind of puppet masters for whatever these big organizations want to push through. But this is around the time of the Lima Agreement and gutting manufacturing in Australia, and we've seen how much that's been gutted, and the result of that now was really just starting to play out and hurt us. But yeah, Gough Whitlam was not happy that the CIA and these intelligence agencies were doing all this secret stuff and wouldn't share it. There was no transparency. And so again, the modern Australia and the version that we're told of history, settled by the British, right, still under the rule of the monarch and all that type of thing. But we've also obviously infiltrated by these intelligence agencies, and this is a really important base. There's been some videos and other information about how deep underground this all goes, and you think about the strategic position of Australia, this being right in the outback, and even Australia, how it kind of remains a bit of a neutral country. I want to get to all this in a second, how I think we're going to play a big role in this, heading towards this technocracy with AI, surveillance, tech, and all that type of thing being what is going to control the world. But it's also interesting that this is located not too far from Uluru, right, in the middle of the outback. And the official story around Uluru, there's a lot of questions and theories about what this even may be, this huge rock just in the middle of nowhere. That's not the only sort of mystery in Australia, though. We've got these deep underground caverns, and they said, they're formed millions of years ago, but there's plenty of stories of tunnels underground all through Queensland. I think even the acknowledged underground tunnel networks in Melbourne and Victoria are some of the most extensive in the world. So, how long have they been here? Was it just natural erosion over millions of years like we've been told? Pretty crazy stuff happening, and all these mysteries in the outback of Australia. And My Lunch Break, who's a great channel, has done a good breakdown on Pine Gap, and obviously some Tartaria Australia flavoured stuff as well, which we'll get to in just a second. But let's change gears a bit and let's get into the kind of satanic, occult, dark history of Canberra, radio channel 666. Just a coincidence, right? Now, this was obviously designed. Melbourne in Victoria used to be the capital before Canberra came over, and it was like they had a fresh start to build this building and this territory and whatever, with these different occult symbologies and astrological alignments and all this weird, wonderful stuff, designed by Marion and Walter Burley Griffin, that were both deep into the occult and theosophy, that type of thing. So if you have a look at Canberra, it's got a lot of similar alignments and structures to Washington, D.C., the Vatican, the pyramids, and all these kind of other power structures aligned here with the Old War Memorial, Mount Ainslie, and a few other things which I'll get into. So there are some good videos that are pretty hard to find these days about all this stuff. We've got the cube there, the black cube of Saturn, 666. I won't go into all these breakdowns, but I'll walk you through some of the more interesting ones now. We know that there's deep connections to Freemasonry, the occult, Kabbalah, secret societies, all this type of thing. But let's have a look at some of these bird's eye views of Canberra. So we've got the Freemason compass there. We've got the pyramid here with the all-seeing eye. We've got the X marks the spot. All this weird, wonderful stuff because they were able to design this landscape basically from scratch and do it how they want, align it to all this weird and wonderful stuff that they believe in. So the original Commonwealth Star in Australia had a six sides on the star, which is interesting itself if you've been down that rabbit hole before. But let's have a look at these Canberra buildings, and we've got the pyramid structure there, the huge flagpole, pyramids, phalluses, this type of thing that we see, again, as I mentioned before, Washington, D.C., the Vatican, the domes, all this type of thing, and all these kind of gematria, Kabbalistic numbers and coincidences. There's Canberra there with the hexagon, the six sides that I mentioned before. Just like the Vatican here, it looks like the head of a snake with the tongue pointing to the black pyramid, and then the bigger metal pyramid above that as well. Just all this dark occult stuff that you don't notice unless you know this stuff and you've got the eyes to see it. We've also got some ties here to Aleister Crowley, occult magic with the upside down T, the circle, all this type of thing on the head of the snake there as well. So very, very weird. Not only that, on the flagpole here, we've got two lots of three of these Maltese crosses, which has got ties to the Rothschilds, the Knights of Malta, the Jesuits, all this weird, wonderful stuff. So why has this kind of been incorporated into the Australia capital? You really have to ask yourself. We've also got the owl, which is on a 33-degree lean in Canberra. If you know about the owl being a symbol for Moloch and all this weird stuff they do at Bohemian Grove, all the elites in these meetups. So yeah, Australia's got it at all, if not more, than some of these other places. Inside, we've got these black and white checkerboard floors, the poles and that sort of thing. But interestingly, right in the middle again, we've got that black cube, which we're going to get to in more detail in just a second. I want to also mention here the Canberra War Memorial, which Canberra kind of looks down through at, which is the dome. Again, just like the Vatican, just like Washington, D.C., you've got the main building and the domes and the phalluses, the uprights and that type of thing. The two towers in Freemasonry, ties to Solomon's temple. So just all this occult architecture that they were able to build from scratch. Now, this was a video that interestingly has been since removed since I went to record this. And this was an old video as well. So sometimes, as you know, if you find a real juicy nugget, you'll go back to visit that page or video and it'll be removed. So this video was all about the astrological alignments to the different stars and, tying it into Moloch and Baal and all these weird gods and pagan beliefs that these elites and secret societies seem to have. But let's talk now about the Shrine of Remembrance, because again, this was meant to be a war memorial and it's got all this kind of Greek, Roman, Egyptian style architecture, a pyramid on top. Just doesn't really have anything to do with war or remembering the soldiers or anything. Weird kind of statues of gods or whatever they are. Just, it doesn't make sense. And once again, it's because it's all full of pagan occult symbolism. These people are obsessed with sex magic and all these weird rituals. And as you can see here, it almost looks like for sperm going to the egg. We've got the checkerboard floors. This looks straight through to an interesting building, which I'll talk to in just a second. And if we go on the inside here, we can see again, the light shines down onto this black cube at on the 11th of the 11th at 11 a.m. So there's your 33 for these, Freemason occult secret societies. Pillars, just very, very weird. Nothing to do with war, really. If we have a look inside, you can still go and do tours and that here. And so it kind of makes you wonder, with things like Port Arthur and Australia being a test bed for the New World Order. I just want to play a little part from this clip here that I mentioned the other day about some of the stuff that we're maybe not told and these occult ties to Port Arthur, if Australia is indeed a test bed for the New World Order and this type of thing, as the video is going to freeze if it's going to let me play it here. on that I think are really important to understand is the occult side of things. And this ties in to something that Annika said in this interview, which was our most popular episode of the year, where she spoke about how April 30 is really important in the Satanic occult pagan calendar. And that's because it was the date that Anton LaVey founded the Church of Satan in 1966. And she spoke about how that week leading up to it is where they do a lot of sacrifices and that type of thing. So obviously, this also has ties to Freemasonry and all these kind of occult ritual style things that you can break down. And this is how these cults and secret societies work with what was reported in local newspapers and all around Australia with the 33 Freemasonry side of it. But I want to get back to that date that Annika mentioned, because Port Arthur started on the 28th, and then the siege overnight led into the 29th of April. So 29-4 is another 33, and then Martin Brighton was sentenced on the 22nd of the 11th, which is another 33, as well as all those headlines. So those of you that are familiar with secret societies and Freemasonry and 33 and all this type of thing, I think that's something that Paul might get into. So as I've kind of mentioned before, a lot of people now have woken up to this, and you can join that Facebook group if you want more info. Watch that interview I did with Paul, or all his episodes on the WASP files. And obviously the strongest testimony, that the official stories and what we're told, was survivor Wendy Skur, who knew Martin and was there on that day and saw it kind of all unfold. But if Australia is a testbed for the New World Order, and we're run by the UN, and one of the documents that got passed to Australia around that time was that they wanted to ban guns and start that crackdown, because what happens in Australia tends to follow in the other Five Eyes countries, right? The UK, Canada, and the US. So Australia was that country where they first wanted to ban guns and then begin the push to de-arm citizens for kind of everything that's happening now. And obviously more recently we've seen Bondi, and they've tightened gun control. But what else have they done? Australia's now looking, as a result of it, we're looking down the barrel of the tightest free speech laws and cracking down on protests and all this other stuff that has nothing to do with what actually happened. So make of that what you will. So inside the shrine there, we've got more weird occult stuff, red checkerboard on the roof, that type of thing. And as I mentioned before, the building that you look straight down to from the shrine is aligned here with William Barak, who was kind of the Aboriginal guy who was trying to stop them settle and take over this land and whatever back in the day. And then they eventually did, and this is meant to be a memorial, but I don't know. What do you guys think? Is that a bit of a slap in the face as they kind of overtook this area or whatever? But make of that what you will. Now, Dale, who's a fantastic researcher, did a 9-part series all about the occult shrine and breaking all this symbolism and weirdness down. But another interesting thing he mentioned in this was their obsession with Aboriginal DNA back in the day, as well as this Melbourne synchrotron for all this weird scientific research. So this is actually officially a part of CERN. So that Hadron Collider, you might have seen those weird occult ceremonies they did there at the opening of that. You've got all your 666s in here. And most people aren't even aware of this, that we have a particle accelerator in Melbourne, and it's pretty hard to find information about. But yeah, there it is. You can look at it just there. So again, what do you guys think they're doing at these facilities? And is it far more weird and wonderful than what we're actually being told? But changing gears, let's get into some of the more ancient Australian history, and if what we're being told is the official narrative. So Campbell and I did that deep dive. He's done heaps of videos about that Tartaria, Australia angle, and where some of these buildings here, again, kind of that Greek, Roman, Egyptian style looking building with columns and stuff. And it was just, there wasn't any infrastructure here, dirt roads, horses and carts. And somehow there's these insane buildings with just incredible architecture absolutely everywhere, scattered across Australia. And what do you guys think? Was this here already? Did they actually build this? Were they able to make all this glass and these bricks when we didn't really have manufacturing base set up? I think the jury's still out on that one, but what I do think is really interesting is some of the ancient Australian evidence. So we've got these hieroglyphs that you can still go and look at today. Interesting, there was some fires that went through here recently, but this is these ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs that are found in Gosford. We've got this Sphinx in Sydney, which people have got mixed opinions about, right? And even all the way through to the Gympie Pyramid and these other, I mentioned some of the landmarks that are, I've heard different stories about that are off limits to the public up in Kakadu and that type of thing. So one researcher I'll get to in just a second that did a lot of work on this was Rex Gilroy. So we've got all this obviously ancient Aboriginal artwork, and what were they trying to depict, and what does this all mean? Some of these saying 50,000 years old or whatnot. Some of these structures that they were built, was it just water erosion? All these usual questions that you've got to decide if the mainstream narrative's right. Fossilized book at a depth of 12 meters. How old is this? Why are these things fossilized and turned to stone? Just a lot of weird and wonderful stuff in Australia, right? But as I mentioned, so Rex Gilroy was a bit of a legendary Australian explorer who went out looking for these pyramids and ancient civilization history and that type of thing. You can still watch some of his videos on YouTube where he found evidence of ancient Phoenician cultures being here in Australia, which obviously rewrites history, and it's all pretty political today with everything going on, right? They probably don't want that to get out. But another wicked episode on all this was with Campbell and Kelly when they were on Archaics, and they did a big deep dive into all the lost history of Australia and some of this evidence as well. So, look, I think Australia's position itself and the way it's kind of remained neutral, China's our main trade partner, a lot of trade with Russia, and yet we've, closely affiliated with the US and those military bases here, with our European settlement official history, story, background, all that type of thing. So, yeah, I think Australia is going to play a big role in whatever happens here next. And I think that Pine Gap military base, with the way the world's heading with AI, technocracy, surveillance, a lot of people are saying that this could be one of the most important military bases in the world. It's the middle of nowhere in Australia. And even some of the talk around, if there's another flood or cataclysm coming, sea levels rise, whatever, this is kind of what Australia would look like even if the sea levels did rise. And, I don't believe that, climate change and ice melting is going to wipe us all out. They've been saying that for decades, right? But if there's actually some sort of flood again, as it suggests, as a lot of the history looks like, this is what Australia's borders would look like. It doesn't really change compared to a lot of the rest of the world where most of the coastal towns would really get wiped out. So, a lot of the elites have got these bunkers being built in New Zealand, Australia. We've got that kind of neutral status, the military bases, this weird occult symbology all throughout Canberra, and some weird stuff happening in Melbourne with the underground tunnels. So, yeah. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. What else have you found or read about? What do you think about Australia and its role as a test bed in the New World Order for rolling out these draconian measures and that type of thing? But I just think that Australia's history and that type of thing is just far more interesting than we're taught at school. So I hope you guys have enjoyed that video. Share it around, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll talk to you again soon. Cheers.